the words session hijacking. The name itself is self-explanatory and may not require a detailed explanation if one understands what it means. To put it in simple terms, it is about an intruder attacking over a genuine session between two computers and using it for sinister purposes.
That's right, Laura. In this module, we're going to be providing details about session hijacking, well-known techniques employed by aggressors, the steps involved in session hijacking, various types of session hijacking, and tools used for hacking or hijacking sessions. And we're also going to talk about how we may protect ourselves from session hijacking attacks. We're also going to give you an overview of how penetration testing can be used to identify vulnerabilities.
We are going to start with an explanation on session hijacking. We want to give you one perspective so that we are all on the same page. As we mentioned earlier, session hijacking is about an aggressor taking control over a session between two machines.
Right.
You are aware that for any session to happen, there must be a valid session ID. This is a packet with identification information. An attacker either sniffs a genuine session ID or predicts a session ID and uses it to get into the system by pretending to be a genuine user. Once he gets or she gets into the session, he or she will try to take over the session and could steal information, cause damage to the system, take data, etc.
In a TCP session, authentication between computers happens really at the beginning of the session. And it's very difficult to identify the intruder if he or she intrudes into the session after the completion of the authentication phase. In a TCP session hijacking, the intruder will take control over a TCP session established between two machines. Now, source-routed IP packets will be used to predict the session ID and then take over the session. The attacker, once in a session, will work to route the packets through his machine, and he can be either watching what is going on in the session, or he or she could even take an active part in the session, pretending really to be a genuine party.
Yeah, and the attacker could employ different techniques to hijack a session. It could be a blind hijacking where the responses on a target machine can be predicted. He or she could employ the man-in-the-middle attack technique where he or she could use a sniffer to figure out the discussion between two machines. If the attacker wants to cause damage, he could employ a denial-of-service attack to ensure loss of a huge number of packets.
That's right. Now, some background information here.
Okay.
We'll tell you about the steps normally followed in a session hijacking attack. The first step will be to understand the connection, how data is flowing, the characteristics of the session, and such things like this. Now, once the attacker understands about the session, he will work to desynchronize the connection to intrude. And once he gets in, he'll start injecting packets into the session to achieve what he wanted to do. Now, in this case, or the case of a TCP session, you can't do much to prevent a session hijack attack. So it's recommended you switch to a secure protocol, as it has been observed that most countermeasures don't work unless you utilize encryption.
What do you think an intruder can potentially do? Well, he could initiate a fraud, steal sensitive and important data, modify data in such a way to change the nature of the data, and much more. Now, what components are susceptible to session hijacking? We are going to start with the authentication protocol Kerberos. You won't have encryption enabled by default, and the authentication is susceptible to attackers.
That's right. Now, we're going to go ahead and talk about one-time passwords, OTP. Now, there are various ways that a one-time password is used to authenticate users. The authentication happens at the beginning of the session and not again until the end of the session. An intruder can get into the session and go undetected and then basically take over the whole entire session. It's really bad.
And when it comes to networks, you look at packets and their originating machine. You would want to filter out packets from unknown sources. However, the source addresses could be forged, and you may not be able to detect the forged addresses from unknown sources. An obscure host could get into an existing connection midstream.
That's right. Now, you may have implemented source address controlled proxies. And if you have, proxies can be directed to control access to specific commands. Now, you do this by keeping the source address of the requester in mind. Source address is easy prey for active or passive sniffers. Now, there is really no easy mechanism to protect from either active or passive sniffing. So once you're aware of the risk, then you'll need to be vigilant in implementing measures to protect yourself against it.
Yeah.